We are not. Thanks. We have talked about the New South, and really the New South, there's some overlap with the early 20th century. Primarily what we're going to talk about in discussing the early 20th century is World War I and the Great Depression. Those are the two time frames that we're going to be looking at because those are the two events of the early 20th century that impact Georgia, really that impact the world. So that's what we're going to talk about. We'll spend a couple of days talking about World War I. We will talk about those couple of years between World War I and the outbreak of the Great Depression. And then we'll spend a lot of time talking about that particular time period, the Great Depression. The New South is drawing to a close. That era that we call the New South is drawing to a close. And while that's happening around the world, we are inching closer and closer to disaster. And it will be a disaster on a global scale. It's a disaster in terms of humanity. It's a disaster in terms of physical destruction. It's just the way it changes the world, the way it sets things up for the next World War. It is an absolute disaster. A couple of questions that we will answer, not today necessarily, but tomorrow certainly. What were Georgia's contributions to World War II or World War I? And in saying that, we mean what did Georgia bring to the table? What did they contribute to the Allied cause? And then kind of the reverse of that. How did World War I impact Georgia? What did it do? Was there a physical impact? Did it impact people emotionally? Did it impact the state physically? Exactly how did it impact the state of Georgia? So we'll answer those two questions regarding Georgia and World War I. But we're also going to learn what caused World War I. Why did the world find itself in this tremendous war that lasted for 4 years and killed millions of people? Anybody know what caused World War I? What's his name? Okay. Eli and Eric are saying it was the murder or the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That was World War I. That is not the cause. That's probably what you've heard. That's probably what you've been taught. Huh? That's the spark that lit the fuse. Okay? But that's not the primary cause. It is the excuse that European countries were looking for to start a war. There were actually three causes that we'll look at. The first we call intense nationalism. Nationalism is having a deep loyalty or devotion to your nationality or your ethnic group. If I were a nationalist in terms of my ethnicity, it would be England and Scotland. Okay, I would be passionate about that background, about that heritage. Well, in Europe, the big deal has to do with Slavic-speaking people. And it's called Pan-Slavism. And it's a political ideology that wants to advance the Slavic-speaking people and wants to unify the Slavic-speaking people. Now, those who spoke Slavic were primarily Russian, Ukrainian, Georgian, Romanian, Yugoslavian, Serbian, Bosnian. A lot of the small East European countries are Slavic and were Slavic-speaking peoples. And the idea of Pan-Slavism is to bring all those people together, to unify under the banner of Pan-Slavism. And they aren't the only people that are pushing their own ethnic group, their own country. We have had periods of nationalism in the United States where America first. America's the only important thing, the only important country. Our interests are more important than everybody else's in the world. And is that ever true? Are one country's interests more important than the rest of the world? No, they're not. We live in a global community. And what happens in one part of the world affects what happens in other parts of the world. I found that out yesterday afternoon when I went to get diesel. And I paid almost $5 a gallon for diesel. Why? Because the price of oil has risen to over $130 a barrel. Why? Because of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine right now. Yep. Isn't that what I just said? Yeah. Thought so. All right. So, cause number 2 is economic rivalry. You have countries that are in competition for resources, for manufactured goods, and then colonialism. Those two go together. Those two walk hand in hand. Economic rivalry, and colonialism. And you know what colonialism is. One country comes in and colonizes or takes over another country. And European countries at the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century are all about colonizing. And they want to colonize one place in particular, and that is Africa. Africa. Is Africa a continent or a country? Sure? Y'all didn't say that very assuredly. Yeah, it is a continent. It is not a country. It is made up of countries. And these European powers go into Africa and they colonize. They take over these individual countries and totally screw up Africa. Africa's never been the same. And it probably never will be the same again because of the influence of those colonial powers. So what do we end up with? We end up with these European countries all wanting a piece of other places. This is actually Central Europe. Turkey, Montenegro, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Bulgaria. Everybody wants a piece. Everybody's grabbing hold. If you had been in Europe during the 19 teens, you might have seen signs like this one, the Slavic Union. And that to me, because I grew up during the Cold War, that looks a lot like Soviet propaganda. If you go back and you look at Soviet propaganda posters, they would look a lot like that. So there's a heavy Russian influence. And in fact, the flag that gentleman is carrying is the Russian flag. All right. So what else happens? Oh, there's Africa. Let's talk about Africa. Africa. You can see Africa in 1914, there is 2 independent countries on the continent of Africa. One is Abyssinia. Anybody know what that is today? Should have learned that last year. So I've heard. Ethiopia. This is Ethiopia today. And interesting thing about Ethiopia is it has never been colonized. It's never been conquered by an outside force. Why? Not really sure, but it never has. So that's Ethiopia today. You have Djibouti. Are you laughing at Djibouti? Somalia. Anyway, and then the other country over here is Liberia. Anybody know anything about Liberia? What? Liberia was actually a country that was created by the United States. James Monroe is the president of the United States, and he decides that one of the ways to solve the issue of slavery is to repatriate the slaves, send them back to Africa. Now, that's fine for the northern states, but it's not too good for the southern states. They don't want that to happen. But there are people who end up going back to Africa. For most of them, it was the first time they'd ever been to Africa because they were born in the United States. And so what does that mean? They don't know the language that's going to be spoken here. They don't know the culture. They don't know the land. They know nothing about where they're going to. Is that a problem? Yeah. I mean, that would be like me picking Daisy up and plopping her down in, I don't know, Swaziland, which is somewhere down in South Africa, I think. Yeah, Swaziland, little bitty country, right around in here. How you think you'd fare? Not too good. She could probably find a Coca-Cola because Coca-Cola's everywhere, right? But that's about it. She's going to live off Coca-Cola because she can't order food. She can't find food. She doesn't know the language. People are going to laugh at her. Blonde-headed, blue eyes, living in Swaziland. Okay? So there are people that go back or that are sent to Africa, and they live in Liberia. But again, there's some problems. We've already mentioned one. The other one is, what happens to the people that are already living there? Fair to them? No. Yeah, it's like you use the term invasive species. Yeah, I like that. So Liberia is an experiment, and it fails. By the way, the capital of Liberia is Monrovia, named after President Monroe. Yeah. So 1914 rolls around. All of Africa, the majority of Africa has been colonized, and it remains colonized. I think the last colony becomes independent in the 1970s. So it's no wonder that Africa is the mess that it is today, because people haven't been allowed to rule themselves. And you have all these different ethnic groups. Y'all know about the Sudan, right? And the genocide that took place there. If you've ever read the book, A Long Walk to Water. If you had advanced English, you probably read that in the 7th grade, right? Okay. So a lot of stuff going on in Africa. I really want to go to Africa one day. I really do. I want to go to this part of Africa. It's supposed to be just incredibly beautiful. It's hot up there. I don't want to go up there. That's the desert. I can go to Arizona and see desert. All right. The third cause is military alliances. You have all of these countries that are all of these countries that are allying themselves with each other. France and Britain. If you're attacked, we'll defend you. If you want to attack somebody, we'll attack them with you. If you're attacked, or if I'm attacked, I expect you to help me. And so we have this going on in Europe. All these military alliances are being formed. And all these armies are being grown. They're being raised up. Well, what do armies do? Why do we have armies? What's the purpose? To protect and to attack. Okay? So we have in Europe these rather large armies that are continuing to grow, and what are they going to do? Are they just going to sit around and twiddle their thumbs and train all day long, or are they going to be used? Well, there are leaders in the governments of these European countries who are looking for an excuse. They're just waiting for the opportunity to start a war. So that becomes a problem because, again, you have all these armies. These countries are like, we want to go use our army. We want to invade Bosnia. We want to invade France. And again, they're just waiting for something to happen. We have basically two different groups. We have what are called the Central Powers, and that's Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, which you know is Turkey. That was rather dramatic. You okay? Embarrassed? No, she falls all the time. All right. So we have the Central Powers. Don't confuse those. Don't confuse the Central Powers with the Axis powers from World War II. Some of the players are the same, Germany in particular, but they are different. And then you have what we call the Allied powers, or Triple Entente. That's Great Britain, France, and Russia. Who's missing? Who? America. The United States is missing. Why? Because they're not in the war. But you have some smaller countries, Belgium, Serbia. Japan is actually part of the Allies. Montenegro. Trying to think. There's a couple more. I did. See? There it is. All right. You ready now? All right. So we have the Central Powers, four major players. This is the Emperor Franz Joseph I from Austria-Hungary. This is Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II from Germany. He's actually insane. Sultan Mehmed V, wearing the little fez, from the Ottoman Empire. And then the Tsar Ferdinand from Bulgaria. And what do they have in common? Well, you don't know how tall they are. What? They're all wearing uniforms. They're all the head of nations, and they're wearing a uniform. Do we see that very often today? Does the President of the United States wear a military uniform? No. Does Canada's Prime Minister wear? No. Does Queen Elizabeth wear a military uniform? Y'all know she had COVID a couple of weeks ago, right? She's a tough old bird. She lived. So yeah, and actually, you know, that's okay. They are the commander-in-chief. They're in charge of the military. And then you have the allies: Serbia, Belgium, France, Great Britain, Russia, Japan, and Montenegro. All right. So 1914 rolls around. And in 1914, that proverbial rubber band that we have talked about lately has been stretched to its limit. It's not going to take much for that rubber band to break. And in June of 1914, it finally breaks. June 28th, 1914. The Archduke and heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie are attacked and assassinated while in Sarajevo. Sophie is the Duchess of Hohenberg, whatever that means. They are actually touring Sarajevo, which is part of their empire. Earlier in the morning, someone threw a bomb at them, it did not go off. In fact, if you read the newspaper reports, the Archduke deflected it with his arm. It was like a small handmade bomb. A bomb did go off behind them and destroyed a vehicle, but the Archduke, and the Duchess survived that. I don't know about y'all, but at that point, I would have said, we're going home. I am not going to stay in Sarajevo. But then again, what are the odds of somebody attempting a second time to attack and assassinate the Archduke? Well, it does happen. A 19-year-old Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip is able to get close enough to the car they're traveling in, pulls a pistol, and shoots both, and both die instantly. The Archduke of head wounds, Sophie of a wound to the chest. Austria-Hungary blames Serbia. Now that's kind of like, Benji decides that he doesn't like the Prime Minister of Canada, and so he travels across the Canadian border. He goes, what's the capital of Canada? Montreal? No. Yeah, okay. He goes and he shoots the Prime Minister. Kills him, dead. Graveyard dead. He's an American. He raises his fist and says, "Long live America!" And then the Canadian Royal Mounties descend on him and beat him to a pulp and arrest him. Canada blames the United States. Benji acted on his own. The American government didn't put him up to it. He just decided, I don't like Prime Minister Trudeau or whatever his name is. And so he goes and he kills him. And there's never any evidence to suggest that the United States government put him up to it, but Canada wants their pound of flesh. They want revenge, and so they declare war on the United States. And we whip them, and we take all their maple syrup and bring it back. You are hanged at sunset one chilly evening from a lamppost at Niagara Falls. Austria-Hungary looks at Serbia and says, he was a Serbian, it's his fault. No, it's not his fault. It's the country's fault. Isn't that kind of ridiculous? Especially when there's no evidence, Miss Dixon, when there's no evidence that the Serbian government had put him up to it. There are actually 5 people. There's Princip, and then there's 4 others who are arrested and convicted of assassinating the Archduke. And here's the Archduke right here. He's a manly-looking man. Got a nice. I wish I could grow that mustache. He had a big old square. Are you saying I got a square head? That might be the squarest head I've ever seen, other than SpongeBob. He does. I mean, that head is big. That's a big head. Big square head. All right. So, Washington Times, of course, reporting that. There's Gavrilo Princip, and somebody said this morning, he looks like he'd been beat up. Wonder why? Because he'd been beat up. The Archduke's coat that he was wearing that day, an artist's drawing of the assassination. Princip is actually standing right here. You can see his head. You can see his gun going off. He's already shot the Archduke, and then he shoots Sophie. Why he shot Sophie, I don't know. Well, I mean, look at all the people standing around. Maybe he was just mean. Who knows? And here they are in death. They are part of the ruling class in Austria-Hungary, and so they have a state funeral, and they lay in state so people can come by and pay their respects. Huh? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we do the same thing. We just don't do it for a couple of days. We do it for a couple of hours. New York Tribune, you can see just reports what happened. And then I found this today as I was going through some stuff. Sentence passed on assassins of Ferdinand. Princip, actual slayer, gets off with 20 years. He's sentenced to 20 years in prison. He actually dies in prison 4 years later of tuberculosis. And then leaders who planned tragedy that plunged Europe into war to die by hanging. The other 4 are sentenced to death. Gets 20 years. I think it's because they realized he was the puppet. You know, he probably never would have done it had the other 4 not convinced him to do it. And he's the youngest of. They're all students, university students, by the way. So you have really 3 causes, and then you've got the match that lights the fuse. So World War I lasts from 1914 to 1918. It is the greatest war ever fought in the history of the world up to that point. World War II will eclipse World War I, and nobody ever thought that would happen. There is a huge call for peace throughout the world after World War I because it was such a devastating war. It's so large. It's so disastrous. They are still, to this day, over 100 years after the war ended, they are still digging stuff up that will kill you. They find unexploded bombs. They find hand grenades. In fact, I read a story a couple of years ago about a potato farmer who had dug up his crop and he was washing it. They have this machine that washes it, and he's standing there watching it, and he notices this weird-looking potato. It's not a potato. It's a hand grenade. No. 100-year-old hand grenade. I don't know how stable that thing was. But, I mean, stuff like that happens all the time. There's certain parts of France where if you go to dig, you have to go and get special permission because there's no telling what you're going to run into. Because after this war is over, people just leave. And there are trenches everywhere because the soldiers actually lived in these trenches to keep from getting killed. So it's terrible. It's called the War to End All Wars. It's also called the Great War, particularly by those who fought in it. I don't think there are any surviving World War I veterans. I think the last one died a couple of years ago. But it was. It's a European conflict. That's where it begins. But it grows into a global war. And at the end, there are 32 countries that are involved in fighting in World War I. All right, you ready? All right, you ready? Yes. All right. The United States is neutral. We're not going to be involved with this. This is a European conflict. It's a European war. We want nothing to do with it. We're just going to sit back and watch what happens. Now, having said that, there are U.S. companies who are selling supplies, weapons, to both sides. There are American citizens who leave the country and go to Europe. They join the French Foreign Legion. They go to fly airplanes. They go to drive ambulances. They go to fight, either because they were seeking a thrill or they believed in the cause. But the United States does not enter the war until 1917. They are neutral. We are neutral until 1917. So some things change. By the way, the picture in the background, does anybody know what that says? Children for sale. Inquire within. That is an actual picture. And I thought it was taken during the Depression. I think it was actually taken in the late 1940s, early 1950s. The woman in the background is selling her children. No, you couldn't. It was illegal then. It's illegal now. She and her husband were both alcoholics. And the children are not sold. They're actually adopted. Different families adopt these children. And the sad part is they grow up apart. The great thing is, as they're adults, they look for each other and they actually find each other. And so they're able to kind of restart their relationship. Needless to say, they didn't like their mom and daddy very much. Anyway, just an interesting picture. These are the countries that were involved in World War I, some 32. A lot of them are colonies. We see that in World War II as well. We see people from the colonies fighting for the Allies and for the Axis powers in World War II. And we see that here as well. Nothing there. Boop. So America finally enters World War I. And I'm going to have to guide you through this because something happened to my notes. I rearranged some stuff by accident. So the U.S. enters the war. President Wilson had vowed to keep America out of the war. That was his campaign promise. We will not be involved in this war that's coming to Europe. And he's able to do that for the most part until he can't. And there are a couple of things. There are actually three things that happen that cause America to declare war on Germany and then Austria-Hungary. So there are three actions. In 1917, the U.S. has had enough, and Woodrow Wilson changes his mind, goes to Congress, and asks for a declaration of war against Germany. The first thing, and this is where your notes are a little weird, if you see the picture, go down to the second paragraph under the picture. It says blank, 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 blank in May of 1915. Everybody got it? Okay. That should say the sinking of the Lusitania in May of 1915. The Lusitania is a passenger ship. It's a cruise ship. How many of y'all have ever been on a cruise? Okay. Could you imagine a German submarine sinking your cruise ship? Well, the Caribbean, it might not be too bad, warm water. But in the North Atlantic, even in May, it's frigid. And so the ship is sunk in the North Atlantic. Hundreds of civilians, actually almost 2,000 civilians are killed. 128 of those are Americans. And to me, that would have been enough. I mean, you're attacking civilians. Here's the Atlanta Constitution reporting that news. Many women and children among 1,198 Lusitania dead. Now, I want you to think about that for just a second. Does the Atlanta Constitution want to go to war? What do you think? We'll find out tomorrow.